Hi guys, welcome back to my channel with Gnomes Live. This is Sharon Oyella, and today I'm going to be crafting with seashells. I collected these the other day on a beach walk with my boyfriend, and Easter came along and I didn't have a gift, so I made him this Camino themed seashell that we had basically walked across Spain last year, 2022, so I made him a themed seashell for that, and then I made a set of nesting shells. 4 of them fit inside each other here. Kind of like those nesting dolls. This was also a gift for my boyfriend on Easter. And there we are together. And October 1st was the day that he asked me to be his girlfriend. And of course I said yes. And now we have it in a little keepsake seashell box. And I made this is for me. There's me and my dad in there. And the last craft that we're going to do is this message in the bottle. And this is super cute. If you want to skip to a certain shell in my project list, you can go to the timestamps below, and each one has its own timestamp. I love little messages, little hidden secrets. Anyway guys, let's take a walk on the beach and then we'll get started crafting with the shells. Beautiful. Before we get started, I think it's important to mention that none of these shells had anything occupying them anymore. There's no living creatures harmed here. And when I brought the shells home, most of them were still attached by a muscle in between the shells, and I just had to pull the shell apart and use an X-Acto knife to scrape away what was remaining. And then I did soak them in hot water and soap for probably a couple of hours, and I did use a toothbrush to clean some of them. Alright, so I'm going to use a fabric and E6000 to hinge this shell together. Okay, there is E6000 fabric glue, but I found that this basic E6000 works just fine. I've never done it with fabric before, but so far it did a wonderful job hinging all my shells. So bear with me on this one because this was the first one that I did. Part of the shell in the back where it naturally hinges with muscle, there are bits that stick inside each other that are like hard, made out of calcium. And I was going to leave those alone and use it as part of my hinge, but I ended up having to scrape those away with my knife. Okay, so I just put the E6000 on one side of the hinge and I let it sit for about 15 minutes. I'm just removing some of the extra there with some alcohol and a Q-tip. So I'm going to let that dry. Once it was dry for about 15 minutes, I just cut the other end of the hinge down to the size that I wanted. And again, I do this a little bit differently with my next few shells. There's no wrong way, it's just whatever ever works, right? So here I'm fitting it together and I'm putting those calcium bits inside each other, and I realized it's just going to hang me up. So I took it apart and then I scraped off with my X-Acto knife those little bits that were sticking up there. And now it hinges a lot better. So this shell, I did a fabric hinge on the inside, and then I put a little extra hinge on the outside because it's a heavier shell, and that seemed to work out well. On my next shells, you'll see I only hinged the outside. So again, I'm just putting the E6000 on the other end of this hinge, and I'm just pushing it down with that little stick, making sure I'm getting into all the little grooves of the shell. So I just wrapped a bit of string around it just to hold it closed while I set it underneath the fan. Alright guys, I'm just going to put another shell in here and show you how I hinged it so you can see clearly what I was doing. The first one, like I said, was just my first one, so I was winging my way along. And there you can see the little calcium deposits there that make the natural hinge in a clam shell like this, along with muscle. So what I'm going to do before I even attempt to hinge this one is just remove those hard bits because they'll just hang you up along the way. So every shell is different, and sometimes the pliers will just take those tips right off, but if they don't come off easily, then just use your X-Acto knife and scrape them off. So again, it'll differ from shell to shell how easily those pieces come off of there. Alright, so now that we have those pieces off, we're ready to hinge it. So I'm just going to put it together, and I'm just going to open it up and close it and just see the best place to put that hinge, and you'll know when you're working with your own shell. And I'm just going to cut a piece of fabric. Now I always round the ends. I think that's a better way to glue the fabric down. If you leave them square, they're most likely will start peeling up. So just round out the ends. And again, the E6000, which has been working brilliantly with all my hinges. I really love this stuff. It is also a toxic fume, so you want to make sure you have good ventilation in your house or wear a mask when you're using it. So I just do the one side, place it down where I want the hinge to go, and then I'm going to really push that in with my fingers, getting all the edges down and kind of pushing it in to the crease of the clamshell itself, which I'm going to explain a little bit more in a second here. So once that part is down, then I'll do the other half. And you want to spread that glue evenly. You don't want to have any dry places on your hinge. And again, right into the crease of the shell and then along the edges, just pushing it all down, making sure there's full contact with that cloth hinge and the shell. So I'm going to put this underneath a fan and leave it sit. I don't need to add anything else to the shell, like hold it closed or anything, because it's actually a really nice fit, this clamshell. So I can just place it underneath the fan as is, and I'm going to go for lunch and we'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like once the glue is a little bit more dry. If you're using a tool like I am to apply the E6000, make sure you wipe that off, because once that glue is dry, it's really hard to get off. Alright, so I was at lunch for about 30 to 40 minutes, and this hinge is dry enough where I can play around with it here. So I'm going to open up the shell, and I want the hinge to allow me to open the shell to a certain point. So you're going to see me, I'm just pushing it back a bit, and there it's perfect, okay? So I just closed it on purpose, I kind of tipped it forward. So when you open it up, you want it to stay up on its own. So you want to check your hinge after 30 minutes to 40 minutes so you can still play around with that hinge. You can push the shell back and put it in position and then leave it dry. This glue takes 24 hours to fully cure, okay? But you have a little bit of play around time. So put your hinge on, set it underneath the fan, let it sit for 30 to 40 minutes, and then you can open up your clamshell and then you can adjust the hinge as you need to. Okay, so it works out perfectly if you do it that way. And yeah, like I said, that was the first clamshell I did at the beginning there. It was kind of like trial and error as I went along. But a couple of clamshells in, and I have some good tips to share with you. So I want to make sure that you got that down before we carry on to the next step, which is drilling a hole into the shell. And I use a Dremel, and a couple things to keep in mind. Shell dust is extremely toxic. So you want to work with a mask or preferably work outside in good ventilation. The other thing is I'm using the pointiest tool that came in my Dremel set. I don't know what it's called. It just was in the set that I bought off Amazon. Okay, and I did all of the holes in my shells the exact same way. So I place it on a lid to collect the dust. And then you have to turn the Dremel on before placing it on the shell. So somewhere in between the lowest and the highest speed, I go in the middle. And then apply a little bit of pressure, not too much because you don't want to crack the shell. And it is going to take some patience. So between 5 and 8 minutes I found to drill one hole. So a little bit of pressure and just keep that drill bit on there until you get through to the other side of the shell. And I decided the easiest way to make a closure was use 1/2 of an earring set. And then I'll stick the back on there, and you can see there's a little bit of that stem that's too long, so I'm going to use my pliers and cut that off. Alright, so that did the trick. It is now the right length, but I'm not going to attach it yet. I'm going to actually gild the outside first before I attach the closure. Alright, so this is the very first time I've ever used gilding technique. I bought this kit off Amazon over 2 years ago, so I've had it on hand, and this is the first time I'm ever using it. So it comes with a glue, a sealer, and these foil sheets, and all the instructions are in the package, of course. Okay, so I'm just going to be winging my way along here, guys. So make sure that you watch other videos on it or just read the instructions that come with your kit. So my first mistake was using a brush that was too big, and I ended up getting puddles and it was dripping all over my table. And it says in the instructions not to leave any puddles on your work. So I'm trying to get all the excess off there. A little bit of a learning curve. So I'm just doing one half first. So I just stuck a binder clip in there to keep it open and let it dry for 20 minutes, and it was tacky enough. Like, you want to leave it dry until it's just a little bit tacky, and then you put the gold sheet on there. And again, the instructions are in the kit, and drying time is different for whatever surface that you're covering. A shell is very porous, and it only took 20 minutes. Okay, then you just lay the sheet on there, and then you take a dry brush and you brush into all the little nooks and crannies, of course. And at the same time, it'll take off the excess. Now, I found when I was done, I had a couple little tiny spots that didn't get covered with the foil. So what I did with it, I just took a small brush, put a little bit of glue in that section that I didn't cover, and then leave it for a few minutes. When it was tacky, I covered it with the foil. So you can overlap the foil. It doesn't matter as long as you just get the surface covered. It was fairly easy. I mean, it wasn't a difficult thing to do at all with this gilding. It's really fun. I'm looking forward to doing it again. So of course I did the one side, and I'm just sticking a binder clip in there just to hold it up and while I do the other side. And you can see there I've switched out the brush. Now I'm using a smaller brush. It's going to make it a lot easier. I was just stirring up the glue there again and brushing it on there, and that time it worked out a little bit easier than the first time. Okay, now that that's done, I'm going to stick the closure on there. So this is the back of the earring. I've already stuck the top part in. So I'm just putting the backing over the stem. Had E6000 on the end, so it will glue itself to the shell. Okay, and I find it takes about 20 minutes before you want to touch anything that you've used E6000 with. It takes 24 hours for it to fully cure, but you can touch it around 20 minutes. You just don't want to be moving it too much. So now I'm sticking in a golden thread on the other side of the shell, and this is what I'm going to wrap around the earring. So I'm just knotting off the end, cutting off the excess, and now I'll use E6000 to hold the knot inside the hole. So just rub that E6000 around there, pull the string down so the knot falls into the hole a little bit more E6000 around there, and now I'm just going to let this dry for about 20 minutes. Alright, so now I can seal this shell using a binder clip again, just to hold the halves apart while I put on the sealer. So I'll just do the top part and then I'll let it sit until it's dry, and then I'll do the other side. This bracelet I actually found on the Camino. So while we were walking across Spain, I found it on a trail, and I carried it around with me hoping to find the previous owner, but I never did. And look at this little shell here. Isn't that perfect? And I'm going to use that as my part of the closure. And I didn't have a needle small enough to fit through it, so I'm just using a very thin wire to pull it through my bead, my little shell bead. And that did the trick. Now I'm just going to wrap it around 3 or 4 times, see how much length I want left there, and then I'll just knot it off. I'm so pleased that I had this bracelet and that I kept it all this time. I mean, how perfect is that? It's actually on the Camino themed shell that I'm making as a gift. And I think that's just wonderful how things work out. So if you lost your bracelet on your Camino in 2022, this is where it ended up. I think it turned out perfect. Meant to be. Alright, so I'm going to decorate this inside with a photo that I printed from Word document. Okay, so I inserted a photo, and then in Word document you can easily just shrink it down using your mouse. Just shrink it down to the size that you want. And I'm using regular white glue to glue those messages in there. I glued my photo to cardstock to make it stiffer. And then to make a little frame that the photo will stick on, I'm using twine. So I'm just going to cut a piece of twine down to size there. And I'm going to dip it fully in the glue, so that's just regular white glue, put it on the shell, and then put a bunch of glue on the back of my photo. And then stick this to the string, and once it's dry, cured, it's really strong. So it's not going to bend, you can't pull it out of there unless you really try. Okay, so now it's all dry. Look at this. I love this, how this turned out. And it's not sitting on the shell at all, so it's not interfering with the hinge. It's just glued to that string. Love it. And John loved it, by the way. He absolutely adores this. And just in case you don't know, the seashell is actually a symbol of the Camino. So that's why that made that extra special. So now we're going to move on to the nesting shells. I just wanted to show you that I hinged all 4 of these shells on the outside only. Okay, so as I was going along with my shells, I got a little bit better at hinging them. So this one, when I hinged it, I let it fall all the way open, just because I was going to have 4 of those in there, and the way I wanted to display them in photos and stuff, I wanted this hinge to open all the way. And the closures I did a little bit differently, just using the string as a closure and the bead to keep it closed. So I'm going to show you on another piece here what I mean. So again, using the Camino bracelet that I found, I had the one end knotted, and then I stuck the bead over the 2 strings. Pull those strings through, and you can see there that the bead itself is going to be part of the closure. Okay, and then I can stick it through a hole in the shell. Now this is just, for example, that hole is obviously way too big, but just pull both of those through, knot them, and then glue the knot in place. And then the 2 strings would go over whatever you're using as a closure, and then the bead can be pulled down to keep it closed. This one is a little bit too loose, so I would actually use probably another 3 or 4 strings in there, just so the bead wouldn't slide as easily up and down the string. Alright, so we'll move on, and again, the biggest shell of the nesting shells is the only one that I put holes into. There's a little hole there that was made in nature. I think little worms or something that will drill themselves into a clam. Man, they must be strong. Anyway, that hole was in the wrong spot, so I had to put my own hole in there. So this time for a closure, I'm using the tip of a push pin, because I thought it looked like a pearl. I thought that was kind of cool. I know it's not an oyster shell, but I still thought it was cool. So again, E6000, and then I pushed the stem in there, and I had cut the stem so short that it wouldn't stick out the other end. I stuck some E6000 right in that hole, and then I'll wipe off the excess, and I'll leave this set overnight before I wrap any string around it, because I can still play around with it after 20 minutes, but you don't want to put any pressure on it until that E6000 is cured, fully cured, and it takes 24 hours, like I said previously. So my tiniest shell that fits in there, I just put a little piece of fabric to help me open the shell, because this one was a little bit more difficult to open than the other ones. Again, I shrunk down a picture of me and John. For this one, I just rolled up some twine, like made a little spiral, dipped it in the glue, and then I held it with a binder clip and let it dry. And I just cut off the excess there. Again, E6000 on the back. I'll stick it right inside the shell there, so it kind of fills up that hole, that gap that would be between the photo and the bottom of the shell. E6000 around the edge of my photo, and then right in the middle of that twine, I can stick this right there, and it worked out perfect. Again, October 1st, 2021 was the first day that he asked me to be his girlfriend. I've actually known him 40 years, but we just started dating in 2021. So here I'm just showing you how the shell opens up. And again, every shell was hinged on the outside. I'm going to show you how I polish these as well to make them look so pretty on the inside. Didn't that work out nice? Gosh, I just love that. I love little nesting items. Really fun. Okay, so I'm just using regular nail polish, clear nail polish, and watch the difference here. So I'm just going to do the one side so you can see the huge difference. These colors are magnificent. The colors of the shell, I just don't want to cover that up at all. It's just beautiful. So I found just plain nail polish gives them that wet look. You can also use like a regular sealer, but I had nail polish on hand. Now that it's dry, watch this. Look at the difference. So pretty. I'm just in awe of these shells. Nature is amazing. The colors that they create. And then the outside of the shell, I found that the nail polish really brings out the pigment. And moving on to the necklace. Now this shell itself is very thin, very light, and I don't want to be covering up that beautiful purple with any fabric. So I'm going to use a tiny piece of fabric on the outside And then I'm also going to put one on the inside, and that will be strong enough to keep it together without overwhelming the shell itself with a bunch of fabric. So you can see a little tiny piece here, and I rounded out the edges just like I did the other ones. And this natural hinge here, the white part of the shell, it has a little bit of a lip. So as I'm applying the fabric, I want to use my fingernail to make sure that I'm getting the fabric right underneath that lip so it catches on. When the glue is dry, it won't be able to come apart. It won't be able to come off the shell, I should say. So I'm just working it in underneath the lip of the natural hinge. And you can see the fabric is just big enough to reach from one side underneath the lip to the other side underneath the lip of that natural hinge. And then I'm going to let this dry for about 20 to 30 minutes. I'll set it underneath the fan, and then we'll come back and we'll do the inside of the shell. Alright, so you can see this is still very flimsy because I just have a tiny hinge on the outside, so we're going to stick another tiny one on the inside. And you can see super tiny there, and still rounded out the edges. And I'm going to put the glue right on the shell itself where I'm going to stick that fabric hinge, just make my life easier. And a little bit of alcohol on a Q-tip to get rid of the excess glue that I put on there. It was oozing out the sides there, so I just want to get rid of that. And now I can set this to dry, but I'm actually going to set it to dry kind of halfway closed. So I'm just going to prop it up here, and after I turn the camera off, I'm actually going to move this over to where my fan is so I can set it underneath the fan. Alright, so it's been long enough that it's dry enough to work with, and you can see it's a lot stiffer than it was when I just had the one hinge on there. So this one here has two hinges, one on the outside, one on the inside, but I dried it in a way that it would open flat. Okay, so I didn't dry it halfway closed like I did with the smaller one. So depending on how you want yours is how you're going to dry it. Also keep an eye on it, of course, after 20 minutes or so, and see if you need to stretch out that hinge a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to turn on my Dremel, and I'm going to put a hole on the top on one side, working from the inside out. And just enough pressure to get that Dremel to work, but not too much pressure that I'm going to crack the shell. Alright, so that took about 2 minutes, maybe 3, to get that hole in there. And now I want to put a hole directly on the other side, but I want it to line up perfectly with the one I just did. So I'm going to use a pin. Make sure it goes through the hole first. And I'm going to use some yellow paint. I'm just going to dip the tip of my pin inside the paint and then put it through that hole and see if I can mark the other side. And that did the trick. I can see a little dot there, so I'm just going to add a little bit more paint so I don't lose it before I stick it down to drill it. And you can see the position of my Dremel after I turn it on. Of course, you turn it on before you stick the drill down, but my Dremel is pretty much straight up and down on this one because I want the holes to go straight through the top of the shell. Okay, so now I'm going to use a chain, and I just have to open up the jump ring, I think it's called a jump ring, so I can get the chain through these two holes. So I went from one side of the shell right to the other, and then of course the jump ring goes back on. And like I said at the beginning, I glued in a special photo of me and my father. And then I covered the photo itself, with a clear nail polish. Alright guys, just before I ended this video, I had an idea about a message in a bottle. So I printed off a message from J.R. Tolkien, and what I'm going to do, well, this was larger, I had to cut it in half so it would fit inside my little tiny bottle. I'm going to age the paper, and I could use instant coffee to do this. It's going to take a little bit of time for it to dry, so what I'll do is I'll just use this distress ink. But if you don't have any distress ink, coffee stain does the same thing, and it's a wonderful way to age paper. So I'm going to age this, and we'll be right back. Alright, so I aged the paper, and I also edged the outside with a darker ink. Okay, I'm going to use a little bit of glue to put these pieces of paper together. And now I'm going to use a toothpick. I'm going to cut off the pointy end, and then I'll roll it up just the end of the paper because I just want to get it started. So a little bit of glue again, place the toothpick on there and roll it just a little ways, and then I'm going to hold it and let it dry. It just takes a few minutes. Okay, once that's dry, you can go ahead and roll it all the way up. I'm rolling it pretty tight because it needs to fit inside that bottle. And to hold it closed, I'm using a very thin wire. I'm just going to wrap it around twice and then cut off the excess and cut off those little ends. And then with my pliers, I'm just going to fix this up so the ends aren't sticking out to poke anybody. So I'll just play around with it until I have a nice little ring. And then I could place it back on there, but I gotta tighten this up first. So I'll re-roll it. Stick the ring back on there. I'm going to make sure it fits before I cut off the other end of the toothpick, and it fits pretty good. So now I can cut off the other end of the toothpick and fit it inside. And the cork itself wouldn't fit anymore. So to take this out, I have to use the tweezers most of the time. And my cork, I cut half of it off, and then the underside of the cork, I made a little hole that fits the little scroll itself. And then I can just pop it in there and the cork will fit this way. How cute is that? Message in a bottle inside a seashell. Love it. Alright my friends, that will bring us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I had so much fun doing these crafts. And until the next time, thanks for watching.